Ryan sat at his desk, the sound of chalk scraping against the blackboard filling the classroom. It was a typical Wednesday morning, and his mind was already drifting, the hum of the lesson blending into the background. But when the question came, when Miss Foster called on him, his heart jumped. "Ryan, can you tell the class when the United States entered World War II, and why?" she asked, her voice cool and professional, as if this was just another routine history question. Ryan's mind raced. He knew the answer. He'd heard his dad talk about it 1,000 times. Tom, his father, was a war hero, a decorated veteran who had been through hell and back. His stories were often filled with pride, not just for the battles he had fought, but for the lessons he had learned and the lives he had saved. But now, sitting in front of Ms. Foster, his mind blanked. The pressure was on, and the laughter of his classmates didn't help. He swallowed hard, trying to recall the details. Well, the U.S. entered in 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor? Ryan said, his voice trailing off. Miss Foster didn't even look up from her papers. Her lips curled into a faint, condescending smile. "Well, almost, Ryan. I guess someone forgot to study their history," she said, with a dismissive laugh. The class giggled, and Ryan felt his face burn. He knew he had messed up. But it wasn't the mistake that stung. It was the way Miss Foster had said it. Like it wasn't just a slip-up in a lesson, but a personal failing. She leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the class, clearly enjoying the moment. "You know," she said, the sarcasm dripping from her voice, "maybe your dad could teach you more about history. I'm sure he's been to enough wars to know a thing or two. Maybe you should let him handle your homework from now on." The room went still, the laughter dying as quickly as it had come. Ryan's stomach twisted, and his hands clenched at his sides. He glanced around, eyes darting to his classmates, but no one spoke up. It was like they had all been waiting for that moment, the joke at his expense. His heart raced, his mind going blank again. His father, Tom, had never made him feel this small. Tom, who had endured unimaginable horrors for his country. Tom, who had taught him that honor and respect meant more than anything else. And now, Miss Foster, someone who didn't know a fraction of what his dad had gone through, was making light of it. Ryan tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it didn't go away. He couldn't say anything, though. What would he say? The laughter was still echoing in his ears. "All right, class," Ms. Foster continued, her voice bright and chipper again, as if nothing had happened. "Let's move on, shall we?" She barely glanced in Ryan's direction. Ryan sat there in silence, the sting of embarrassment burning in his chest. He wanted to disappear, to shrink down into his seat and vanish from the room. But instead, he sat rigid, holding himself together as best as he could. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, Ryan was the last to leave. As he shuffled out into the hallway, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. The whispers followed him as he walked, but he didn't dare look back. He walked straight home that day, the weight of the humiliation clinging to him like a second skin. He tried to tell himself it wasn't that big of a deal. It was just one class. But as the hours ticked by, he kept replaying that moment in his head, the sound of Ms. Foster's laugh, the way she had mocked his dad, the way she had made him feel so small. When he got home, his dad was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through some papers. Tom looked up and smiled, but Ryan couldn't return it. His father's face softened when he saw the expression on his son's face. "Hey, you okay?" Tom asked, his voice low and steady. He was a man of few words, but the concern in his voice was palpable. Ryan hesitated, staring down at his shoes. His dad was always the strong one, the one who taught him how to handle everything, how to face his problems head on. But right now, Ryan didn't feel like he could face this one, not the way his dad might expect. "Yeah, I'm fine," Ryan lied, forcing a small smile. Tom studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp. "You sure? You don't seem fine, son." Ryan's shoulders slumped. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure how to explain. He hadn't even told his father about Miss Foster's ridicule yet. But it was like everything that had happened in class was stuck in his throat. Finally, he muttered, "I messed up in history class today. Miss Foster made fun of me. And she said some stuff about you, too." Tom's expression darkened, the corners of his mouth tightening. Ryan looked up to see his dad's eyes, those eyes that had seen the worst of humanity, that had stared down danger time and time again without flinching. Tom sat up straighter, the weight of his military experience giving him an air of authority. He wasn't the type to get angry, but Ryan could see that this was different. "She mocked you? And me?" Tom asked, his voice dangerously calm. Ryan nodded, the lump in his throat growing bigger. "Yeah. She said maybe you could do my homework because you've been to enough wars to know something about history." Tom took a deep breath, his face unreadable for a moment. Then slowly he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked over to Ryan, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. "Listen to me, Ryan," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "You don't ever let anyone make you feel small, especially not for what I've done. I'm proud of you, and I know you're better than that. You don't need to take her words to heart." Ryan looked up at his father, the weight of the day still heavy on his chest. Tom paused for a moment before speaking again. "Tomorrow, we're going to handle this. I'll make sure she understands what it means to disrespect not just you, but what this country owes to every person who's served." Ryan's eyes widened. "You're going to do something?" Tom nodded, a fire in his eyes that Ryan hadn't seen before. "You bet I am. You don't disrespect a veteran's family, not on my watch. I don't care what anyone thinks. This ends tomorrow." Ryan felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time that day, he didn't feel alone. His dad was on his side. The feeling of protection, of strength, returned, and Ryan realized that no matter what Ms. Foster had said, he wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about school anymore. It was about showing the world that respect, for himself, for his family, and for everyone who had sacrificed, meant more than anything else. The next day, Tom would make sure Ms. Foster understood just how far she had crossed the line. The next morning, the air was thick with anticipation. As Ryan sat in the car with his father, his stomach churned with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. He hadn't expected things to escalate like this. His father had always been calm, collected, a man who seemed to know how to navigate every situation. But now, sitting next to him in the passenger seat, Ryan couldn't help but feel nervous. Was he doing the right thing? Was he about to make everything worse? Tom's hands were steady on the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. But there was a sense of purpose in his demeanor that Ryan had seen before, right before one of his father's big missions, when he was about to face down something that had the potential to be bigger than anything they had faced before. This wasn't a battlefield, but in some ways, it felt like one. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Tom turned to Ryan. "Remember, we're here to do what's right. You don't have to carry this burden alone. I'm with you. Always." Ryan nodded, the knot in his chest loosening just slightly, knowing that whatever happened next, his father would be by his side. But even with Tom's words of reassurance, he still felt a pang of fear. Fear of what Ms. Foster would say, how the principal would react, and what the other students would think. When they entered the school, the usual buzz of students filling the halls seemed strangely distant. Tom's presence was commanding, and it felt like the hallways grew quieter as they walked toward the principal's office. Word had spread fast. Ryan wasn't sure how, but it had, and already the murmurs had started. He felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him, but this time, he didn't shrink back. This time, he walked tall, knowing that his father was behind him, knowing that they were about to take a stand for something bigger than an insult. They arrived at the principal's office, and Tom knocked on the door with a quiet authority. Principal Carter, a middle-aged man with graying hair and glasses that seemed to always be slipping down his nose, looked up from his desk with a mild expression of surprise. "Tom," he said, standing up quickly, "I didn't expect you here today. What's going on?" "Can we talk for a minute?" Tom asked, his voice calm but firm. Principal Carter gestured for them to come inside. Ryan followed his father into the office and took a seat in one of the chairs across from the desk, his hands clenched in his lap. He felt like a spectator, even though this was his fight. Tom, however, took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the principal as he took his seat. "Look, I know you have a lot on your plate, but I need to address something serious," Tom began. "Yesterday, my son was humiliated by one of your teachers. Ms. Foster mocked him in front of the class for a mistake he made in history, and worse, she belittled both him and me, insinuating that I might be involved in his schoolwork because of my military service." Principal Carter's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he glanced toward Ryan, as if waiting for him to speak, but Ryan remained quiet. He wasn't sure what to say. "I've always respected this school and the work you do here," Tom continued, his voice still controlled, but the tension was unmistakable. "But I can't let this go. This isn't just about my son being embarrassed. This is about respect for my family, for every family that's ever sacrificed for this country." Principal Carter sat back in his chair, folding his hands together. There was no dismissing the gravity of what Tom was saying, and Ryan could see the flicker of concern in the principal's eyes. Carter had always been a man of routine, but this was something else, something that cut deeper. "I understand, Tom, but I'm sure Ms. Foster didn't mean to be disrespectful. She's a good teacher, and she's been here a long time. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding," Carter said, trying to maintain his usual calm demeanor. "A misunderstanding?" Tom's voice hardened. "My son isn't some punching bag for a joke, and I won't stand by and let someone who's supposed to be a role model to these kids, someone who teaches them about respect, disrespect my family, especially in front of a whole class." Ryan could see his father's anger building now, but it wasn't uncontrolled. It was focused, deliberate. It was the anger of a man who had fought for his country and was now fighting for his son's dignity. Carter seemed to hesitate, running a hand through his hair as he processed the situation. He was caught between his loyalty to the school staff and the undeniable truth that Tom had a point. There was no way to minimize what had happened without addressing it. And as much as he didn't want to get involved in a confrontation with one of his teachers, he couldn't ignore the fact that this had gone too far. "I'll talk to Ms. Foster," Carter said finally, his voice quieter, more reserved. "I'll have a conversation with her about the incident. But I don't want to escalate this. We don't need to make a public spectacle of it." "Then I'll escalate it," Tom replied sharply, leaning forward, "because I'm not going to let you sweep this under the rug. Not this time, not for my son, not for my family." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the clock ticking in the background. Principal Carter looked between Tom and Ryan, and finally, with a reluctant sigh, he gave a small nod. "I'll take this seriously, Tom. I promise you that. But please, let me handle it my way. Let me speak with Ms. Foster and come to a resolution." Tom remained silent for a beat, his eyes unwavering. He could feel Ryan's gaze on him, and he knew his son was watching him, waiting for him to make the call. But as much as Tom wanted to see swift justice, he knew this wasn't just about one person. It was about making sure the message was clear. Disrespect, especially towards those who served their country, would never be tolerated. "All right," Tom finally said, leaning back in his chair. "But I want this resolved, and I want an apology. An honest one, not a quick sorry to make things go away." Carter nodded. "Understood. I'll make sure we handle this appropriately." Tom stood up, his son following suit. Before they left the office, Tom turned back to the principal, his voice lowering with quiet intensity. "Make sure you let Ms. Foster know. This isn't just about one student. This is about the respect that every veteran deserves. This is about dignity, and I won't stand for anything less." With that, they left the office. As they walked down the hallway, Ryan glanced at his father, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like someone truly had his back. They weren't just going to let the disrespect slide. They were going to make sure this town knew that they stood for something: honor, integrity, and the idea that no one, especially not a teacher, could tear that down. And no matter what happened next, Ryan knew he wasn't alone. He never would be again. The next day at school was heavier than Ryan had anticipated. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of yesterday's events pressing down on the halls. The whispers were louder, the stares more lingering, but it wasn't the judgment of his classmates that bothered him. It was the uncertainty of what would happen next. Tom had made it clear that he wasn't going to let the disrespect slide, but Ryan didn't know what making it right looked like. All he knew was that everything was about to change. He walked to his locker between classes, the noise of students bustling around him barely registering. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation he had overheard between his father and Principal Carter. He didn't know exactly what Tom had said, but he had seen the intensity in his father's eyes. He had seen the fire. Ryan wasn't used to seeing his dad so fired up, not in a way that wasn't related to his service or the struggles he had faced during his deployments. But today, it was different. Today, his dad was fighting for him. "Ryan!" He turned at the sound of his name, his best friend Eli, catching up to him in the hallway. Eli had been with him through thick and thin, but Ryan could see the worry in his friend's eyes. The news of the confrontation with Ms. Foster had already spread, and it seemed everyone had an opinion about it. "Hey, you good?" Eli asked, his brow furrowed. "I heard your dad went to the school yesterday. What happened?" Ryan shrugged, trying to act like it didn't bother him. "I don't know yet. He said he talked to the principal. They're gonna handle it." Eli's gaze flickered with a mix of skepticism and concern. "Ryan, man, I get it. What she did was messed up. But, I mean, your dad is like a war hero. Everyone in town knows that. Are you sure you want this to get out of hand? It's kinda crazy, don't you think?" Ryan felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. He appreciated Eli's concern, but he knew his friend didn't quite get it. Eli hadn't grown up with a father like Tom, someone who had sacrificed so much, someone who had fought for honor and respect. Eli couldn't understand what it felt like to have that respect mocked, not just for his father, but for the entire military community. "I don't think it'll get out of hand," Ryan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "My dad said he's gonna make sure it gets handled right. She's gotta know what she did wasn't okay." Eli nodded, but the concern didn't leave his face. "Just don't get too caught up in it, okay? It's not worth causing a big scene." Before Ryan could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of the passing period. He shoved the conversation to the back of his mind and headed for class, trying to ignore the voices that seemed to rise in pitch every time he entered a room. The hallway felt like it was closing in, and he couldn't escape the feeling that everyone was watching him. It wasn't just the kids in the hall, it was the adults too, the ones who had heard about what happened and were now gossiping behind closed doors. When he arrived in Ms. Foster's class, the tension was palpable. The usual bustle of students settling into their seats was replaced with uneasy silence. Ryan could see it in the way his classmates avoided looking directly at him, the way some of them whispered in hushed tones, their eyes flicking to him before darting away. He sat in his seat, feeling like the target of a storm he hadn't asked for. Ms. Foster entered the classroom moments later, her usual brisk steps subdued. She avoided making eye contact with Ryan, her eyes fixed on the front of the room as she began handing out assignments. She seemed like a different person altogether. The usual sharpness that defined her demeanor had been replaced with something softer but colder. Ryan couldn't quite place it. "All right, class, let's get started," she said, her voice flat. She didn't seem to be in the mood for her usual banter, the energy she normally brought to the room now missing. It was obvious that the weight of what had happened the previous day was hanging over her. She tried to continue with the lesson, but the awkwardness between her and Ryan was palpable, and it seeped into the room like a shadow. Ryan focused on the lesson, trying to keep his attention on the work in front of him, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop wondering what would happen next. Was this the moment that would change everything? He had heard that Ms. Foster was going to be talked to by the principal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on behind the scenes would be more complicated than he could predict. The class passed in a blur, and when the bell rang, Ryan was out of his seat before anyone else had even started packing up. He didn't want to linger. He didn't want to feel the weight of the stares on him any longer. But as he walked out of the classroom, he found himself face to face with Ms. Foster. She was standing near the door, her arms crossed, a reluctant expression on her face. For a moment, they just stood there, the distance between them filled with an awkward tension. "Ryan," Ms. Foster said quietly, her voice almost soft. "Can we talk for a second?" Ryan stopped in his tracks. He didn't want to talk to her. He didn't want to hear any half-hearted apology or lame excuse for her behavior. But before he could say anything, she continued. I just want to say that I'm sorry for what happened yesterday," she said, her voice lower now, almost hesitant. "I was out of line, and I shouldn't have said what I did. It wasn't professional, and I know it hurt you. That wasn't my intention." Ryan's eyes narrowed. This apology felt too rehearsed, too forced. "You think saying those things was just an accident?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You mocked my dad in front of the entire class. You think that was just a joke?" Miss Foster's face flushed slightly, and she opened her mouth as if to respond, but Ryan cut her off. "You don't know anything about my dad," Ryan continued, his anger rising. "You don't know what he's been through. You don't get to make fun of him or me, not like that." She looked down, her shoulders slumping. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." For a moment, Ryan just stood there, his chest heaving with emotion. This wasn't the apology he had expected, but it wasn't the apology he had wanted either. It didn't fix the sting of being humiliated in front of everyone, and it didn't change the way Ms. Foster had made him feel small. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just walked past her, not looking back. He could hear her mutter another apology behind him, but he didn't care anymore. It wasn't enough. As he walked down the hall, the weight of the conversation still pressed against his chest. Ms. Foster might have apologized, but Ryan knew that this wasn't over. The real test was yet to come. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for his dad, for everything he had sacrificed, and for what was right. And he wasn't going to let anyone forget it. The following days felt like a blur, each one dragging on longer than the last. The moment of confrontation with Ms. Foster hadn't provided the relief Ryan had hoped for. If anything, it only added to the weight of the situation, leaving him with a lingering frustration. Her apology had been hollow, a gesture that felt more like a formality than an earnest attempt at reconciliation. It wasn't enough to take away the sting of the joke, the way she had humiliated him and his father in front of their peers. Despite the apology, things didn't return to normal. The air at school was still thick with tension. Whispers followed him in the halls. People stared when he walked into a room, their eyes a mix of curiosity, judgment, and pity. And Ms. Foster, for all her attempts to smooth things over, couldn't seem to stop herself from casting an occasional glance his way, one that was so loaded with guilt and uncertainty that it made Ryan uncomfortable. He could tell she was walking on eggshells now, but that didn't erase what she had said, or the damage it had caused. One afternoon, as he sat alone in the cafeteria, Ryan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down and saw a text from his dad. "We need to talk. Meet me after school." His stomach dropped. He knew that tone. It wasn't a casual text, the kind Tom would send just to check in. This was serious. Ryan's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Had the school taken further action? Was Ms. Foster going to be fired? Was his dad about to go in and cause a scene, to push things further than they had already gone? Ryan tossed his lunch aside and made his way out of the cafeteria, the uneaten food now just a dull afterthought. His heart raced as he headed toward the parking lot. His dad was already there, standing by his truck, his arms crossed, his face set in the familiar, resolute expression Ryan had seen so many times over the years. But today, there was something different. Something that made Ryan feel the weight of the moment pressed down on him. When he reached the truck, Tom looked down at him, his eyes softening just slightly. "You good?" he asked, his voice low but full of concern. Ryan shook his head, not sure what to say. "I don't know, Dad. I don't know what to think anymore. Things haven't gotten better, not really." She apologized, but it doesn't feel like enough. Tom sighed, the weight of the conversation settling in. "I know, son, I know. But I need to tell you something. I've been talking with the principal." Ryan's chest tightened. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I'm not letting this go," Tom said firmly, looking Ryan in the eye. "Not for you, not for any of the kids who don't have someone to fight for them. I went back to Principal Carter. I told him what happened and what needs to be done. And we're taking it further." Ryan froze. He wasn't sure what taking it further meant, but he didn't like the sound of it. "Dad, what do you mean? I don't want this to turn into something huge. It's just one teacher, right? Just let it go. It doesn't have to be a big deal." Tom's expression softened, but his gaze remained steady. "It's not about one teacher, Ryan. It's about more than that. It's about respect. It's about making sure something like this doesn't happen to anyone else. You can't let people treat you like that, and you can't let them treat your family like that either." "But I don't want to make a bigger mess of it," Ryan muttered. "I just want to move on." "I know you do," Tom said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. "But sometimes you have to stand up for what's right. Sometimes you have to fight the battles that are uncomfortable, even when you don't want to." Ryan looked away, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot. His father's words sunk in slowly, but he couldn't help the nagging feeling that this wasn't going to end well. His whole world had been about to shift the moment Ms. Foster made that comment. But now it felt like the entire town was about to watch as things unraveled. "I spoke with Principal Carter," Tom continued, And he's agreed to hold a town meeting next week. We'll bring the issue to the public. You know, let everyone hear about the situation and how it was handled. It's not just about Miss Foster anymore. It's about making sure veterans and their families are respected. Ryan's stomach twisted. A public meeting? It felt too much, too open, too exposed. It wasn't just his father fighting now. It was everyone. I don't know about this, Dad. What if it makes things worse? What if people start picking sides? Tom's face softened, and he placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I get it, I really do. But we're doing this for all the right reasons. Not to shame anyone, but to make sure the right thing is done. If we don't stand up now, then what? We let this go? We let it slide under the rug, like it never happened? Ryan shook his head slowly. He didn't know what to say. The idea of a town meeting, of people from all around the town, coming together to talk about the situation, it terrified him. But deep down, he knew his father was right. This wasn't about just one bad teacher. It was about something much bigger. It was about respect, about honor, about standing up for what was right, no matter how uncomfortable it made him feel. I'll do it, Ryan said, finally meeting his dad's gaze. His voice was quieter now, but resolute. But I don't want this to blow up more than it has to. I just want it to be over. Tom nodded, his hand still on Ryan's shoulder. I understand. I won't let this become something ugly. But we can't back down. Not now. Not when it matters. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The weight of what his dad had just told him settled into his chest like a heavy stone. He wasn't sure how this would play out. He wasn't sure what the community would think or how people would react. But one thing was certain. He couldn't stay silent anymore. I guess it's time to face the music, Ryan said quietly, his voice stronger now. Tom gave a half smile. That's the spirit. As they climbed into the truck and Tom started the engine, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was going to be a hard one. But it was a road he was going to walk, with his father by his side, no matter where it took him. The weight of everything still hung over him, but now, he wasn't running from it. He was facing it head on, and he was ready. The days leading up to the town meeting were a whirlwind. Word about the situation spread quickly, as it always did in small towns, and soon enough, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Ryan couldn't escape it. The whispers at school grew louder, the stares more intense. His classmates, some of whom had been quiet or indifferent about the whole thing, now began to approach him with awkward comments or hesitant apologies. It didn't help. He didn't know how to feel about their newfound attention. He just wanted things to go back to normal, but normal wasn't an option anymore. Ryan didn't want to think about the meeting, but it hung over him like a storm cloud. It wasn't just about the apology anymore. It was bigger than that, about the town, about the principles of honor and respect, about his father, and about the sacrifices his family had made for the country. It was about the truth, and now that truth was about to be laid bare for everyone to hear. The night before the meeting, Tom sat on the front porch, his old military jacket hanging loosely on his frame, the fading daylight casting long shadows over the yard. Ryan joined him, sitting on the step beside him, both of them watching the world go by in silence. The tension between them was palpable, but unspoken. You ready for tomorrow? Tom asked quietly, his gaze focused on the horizon. Ryan shrugged, trying to seem casual, but he could feel the weight of the question. It wasn't a simple yes or no answer. There was no avoiding the fact that things were about to get uncomfortable. He didn't know how the town would react, how the community would respond. Would they understand? Or would they think his father had overstepped? I don't know if I'm ready for all of it, Ryan admitted after a long pause. But I know you're doing what's right. It's just scary, you know? Tom turned to face him, his eyes softening with understanding. I know, son. I know it's hard, but standing up for what's right, sometimes it takes more courage than anything we've faced on the battlefield. You're doing the right thing by speaking up. Ryan looked at his dad, taking in the calm expression on his face, the steady breath that told him Tom was ready for whatever was coming next. It made Ryan feel like he wasn't alone in this. His dad had faced down far worse than anything this town could throw at him, and he wasn't going to back down now. I'm not sure I have your strength, Dad, Ryan said quietly. I don't know if I can do it the way you do. Tom placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. You don't need to be me, Ryan. You just need to be yourself. You've got more strength in you than you realize." Ryan met his father's gaze, the words sinking deep. He wanted to believe them. He had always looked up to his dad, always admired the way Tom carried himself, the way he could stand tall in the face of adversity. But now, standing on the precipice of what was to come, Ryan wasn't sure if he had it in him. "Tomorrow will be tough," Tom said, breaking the silence again. "But you're not going in there alone. You've got me, and you've got the whole town behind you, and I promise you, we're gonna get through this." The meeting the next day felt like a weight bearing down on Ryan's chest as he stood in the crowded town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The long wooden tables where town officials normally sat were now filled with parents, teachers, veterans, and reporters, everyone there to witness what would unfold. Ryan sat at the front with Tom, his nerves nearly overwhelming him. His father sat beside him, calm and collected, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes scanning the room as if he had done this 100 times before. But Ryan couldn't help feeling like the entire room was waiting for him to make a mistake, for him to crumble under the pressure. The whispers had already started. The town had already chosen sides, and Ryan knew it. He just had to make sure he didn't lose his footing. Principal Carter stood at the front, his voice booming through the microphone as he called the meeting to order. "Thank you, everyone, for coming," Carter said, looking at the sea of faces in the room. "As you all know, we're gathered here today to discuss an important issue regarding one of our teachers, Ms. Foster, and an incident that occurred earlier this week. We're here to listen to all sides and come to a resolution that ensures our school remains a respectful and supportive environment for all students." The crowd was quiet, every eye on Carter, but Ryan could feel the tension creeping into the room. People were here for answers, but they were also here to see what would happen when the issue of military service and respect was brought into the spotlight. Ryan could already feel the murmurs starting again, the energy in the room shifting. Tom stood up first, his voice steady and strong as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you for coming, everyone," he began, his eyes scanning the faces in the room. "I'm Tom Harlow, and I'm here because my son, Ryan, was ridiculed and belittled by Ms. Foster in front of his classmates. She mocked him for a mistake he made in class, and then she made it worse by insulting my service, by making a joke about my military background." There was a collective shift in the room. Some of the adults nodded, a few of the students whispered, and Ryan felt every word of his father's speech settle into his bones. "I've fought for this country," Tom continued, his voice growing firmer. "I've bled for it. And my son, Ryan, he's proud of the service I've given. And I'm proud of him for standing up for what's right, for speaking out against the disrespect that was shown. This isn't just about one teacher's mistake. This is about something much bigger. This is about respecting the men and women who have given their lives to serve. This is about teaching our kids that honor matters. And that's why I'm here today." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood beside his father. The room had gone completely silent, everyone hanging on Tom's every word. His father's presence commanded respect, and Ryan could feel it. He was a part of this fight, a fight for what was right. After a brief pause, Tom turned to Ryan, putting a hand on his shoulder, his voice softer now, but still firm. "Ryan, why don't you come up here and tell everyone how you felt when you were made fun of, when you were humiliated in front of the class?" Ryan's stomach twisted at the idea of speaking in front of everyone. His throat tightened, but there was no turning back now. Slowly he stood up, his knees trembling slightly as he made his way to the front. He looked out at the sea of faces before him, teachers, classmates, parents. Everyone had gathered to hear his side, and now it was his turn to speak. When he reached the podium, he paused for a moment, looking out over the crowd. He swallowed the lump in his throat, trying to find his words, trying to hold on to the strength his father had given him. "I never wanted to be the center of attention," Ryan started, his voice quieter than he wanted it to be. "I didn't want this. But when someone disrespects my family, my dad, someone who's done more than I could ever explain, I can't stay quiet. What Ms. Foster said wasn't just a joke. It hurt. It hurt me, and it hurt my family, and I won't let that go unnoticed." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I know my dad didn't want this to turn into a big thing, but I don't think anyone should be allowed to disrespect anyone, especially not veterans and their families. We deserve respect, all of us, and I won't sit back and let it happen." Ryan's heart was racing now, but the words were coming easier. He could feel the weight of the town's eyes on him, but it wasn't as scary as it had been when he first walked in. This was his truth, and he was telling it. The room was silent when he finished. Then, slowly, it started. The sound of applause. At first, it was hesitant, but then it grew louder, more certain. Ryan looked over at his father, who gave him a proud nod, his eyes gleaming with something deeper than pride, respect. For the first time in days, Ryan felt lighter, like the weight had finally lifted. This wasn't just about a teacher's mistake. It was about standing up for what mattered, and Ryan had just taken the first step in showing the town, and the world, that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones you fought for the people you loved. The applause faded, but the buzz in the room remained. Ryan could feel it, the eyes of the town still on him, waiting for what would come next. He stood at the podium, feeling the rush of adrenaline course through him, but also an unfamiliar peace. The words had come out easier than he expected. He had told the truth. And for the first time in days, he felt like the weight of it all wasn't crushing him. It was freeing him. As the clapping died down, Principal Carter cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the matter at hand. "Thank you, Ryan, for speaking your truth. We now need to address the issue at the core of this meeting." He paused, glancing at the other panel members, all of whom seemed tense, unsure of how to proceed. As you all know, this isn't just about a single mistake. It's about ensuring that our school community remains one that fosters respect for every student, no matter their background. Ms. Foster, seated in the back of the room, seemed to shrink into herself. Her posture was stiff, her face flushed with embarrassment, but her eyes were focused on the floor. Ryan could feel the anger rising again. She was here, sitting comfortably while his life had been turned upside down by her careless words. It wasn't just about being ridiculed. It was about the bigger picture, about the way people like her had the power to make others feel small and insignificant. His father had fought for dignity on the battlefield, and now Ryan was fighting for his dignity in the classroom. Tom stood beside him, his hand resting gently on Ryan's shoulder. "We're not here to make enemies. We're here to make sure this doesn't happen again," Tom said to the room, his voice unwavering, a clear reminder to everyone that this wasn't just about punishing one person. It was about setting a precedent. The school should be a safe place for every student, especially those from military families, and as a community, we owe it to our children to show them that respect is earned, but it's also expected. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, some nodding in silent understanding. Tom's words had struck a chord with them, not just as a father, but as a man who had served, who had sacrificed. They understood that this wasn't just a simple conflict between a teacher and a student. It was about recognizing the value of each person, especially those who had given so much. Ryan watched as the principal turned his attention to Ms. Foster. "Ms. Foster," he began, his voice more neutral now, "you've heard the concerns raised, and while I understand that you may not have intended harm, it's clear that the impact of your words was far-reaching." Ms. Foster looked up then, her face still flushed, but her expression softening. She stood up slowly, her shoulders slumping as she made her way to the front. Ryan could feel his pulse quicken again. She was about to apologize, but he couldn't let it be that simple. An apology wasn't enough, not after everything. "Ryan," Ms. Foster began, her voice low, I never should have said what I did. I deeply regret mocking you and your family. My words were out of line, and I'm truly sorry for the hurt I caused. I never meant for it to go this far." Her voice wavered, and Ryan could see the cracks in her confidence. She wasn't just apologizing for mocking him, she was apologizing because she knew she had crossed a line, and now the consequences were being laid bare. The crowd had fallen silent, waiting for her next words. Tom stepped forward slightly, his eyes not leaving Ms. Foster. "Apologies don't fix everything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Words have weight. And when you mock a child for something as important as his family's sacrifices, that damage is real. It's not something that just goes away with a quick, sorry." Ryan's heart raced, but his dad's words gave him a strange comfort. This was what it was about, not letting things slide, not letting people get away with things that hurt others. "I understand," Ms. Foster said quietly, but her voice was steady now. "And I will do whatever it takes to make this right. I've already spoken to Principal Carter about undergoing sensitivity training. I'll take full responsibility for my actions, and I won't let this happen again. I see now that there's a lot I need to learn, not just about history, but about the families who sacrifice for this country. I was wrong to dismiss that." Ryan stared at her, his anger still simmering. An apology was one thing, but change was something else. He didn't know what it would take to fix things, but he didn't want this to be the end. He didn't want Ms. Foster to just say the words and move on. He wanted her to truly understand the weight of what she had done. Principal Carter cleared his throat, bringing the meeting back into focus. Ms. Foster has acknowledged the harm she caused, and she is committed to taking steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. We'll be discussing further steps with the school board, but for now, we will work toward a resolution that holds everyone accountable. He paused, looking around at the crowd, his voice gaining strength. This incident has opened our eyes to the need for a broader conversation about respect for all families, especially those who have served. We will implement workshops and discussions to educate both staff and students about the sacrifices made by veterans and their families. Ryan felt a weight lift off his chest, but it wasn't relief. It was more like the acknowledgement that something real had been done. The room was finally moving toward a solution. The meeting continued, but for Ryan, the rest of the words blurred into the background. His mind was on what had just happened. The way the town had stood behind him. The way his father had made it clear that this wasn't just about a single teacher, but about standing up for something larger. As the meeting wrapped up, Ryan and Tom stood together. Ryan's heart still thudded in his chest, but the storm inside him had calmed. People came up to him, shaking his hand, patting him on the back. Some of the other kids even apologized to him, awkwardly at first, but Ryan could see the sincerity behind their words. When the last person left the room, Tom looked at Ryan, his face proud but soft. "You did good, son. You did more than just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone who's ever been overlooked, for every person who's been disrespected." Ryan smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." Tom gave a small chuckle and ruffled Ryan's hair. "You've got it in you. You just needed to believe it." As they walked out of the town hall, the sky was darker now, the air cool against their skin. But for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like the weight that had been pressing down on him was finally lifting. He wasn't sure what would happen in the days to come, but he knew one thing for sure. He had stood his ground, and that was a fight worth winning. The days after the meeting passed with a strange sense of quiet in the town. It wasn't the usual hum of gossip and small talk that accompanied the latest local drama. It was more subdued now, like the calm after a storm. People still whispered about what had happened, but there was a different tone now. It wasn't just about Ryan and his father. It was about a community forced to confront its own assumptions, forced to reckon with the way it had treated those who served. Ryan felt the weight of it all in ways he hadn't expected. The school had made its adjustments. Ms. Foster was on leave for the sensitivity training, and Principal Carter had instituted new workshops about military families and their sacrifices. Ryan had even been asked to speak at one of them, though the idea of standing in front of a crowd and talking about what had happened still made his stomach flip. He wasn't sure he could stand in front of his peers again without feeling that same vulnerability, that sting from the way it had all started. But it wasn't just at school that things were shifting. Everywhere he went, people seemed to look at him differently. It wasn't as if they were congratulating him or treating him like a hero. But there was a quiet respect now, something unspoken in the way they looked at him. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. It was like the town had collectively decided that they weren't going to ignore what had happened anymore. And for the first time in his life, Ryan realized that standing up for what was right meant more than just making a point. It meant changing the way people saw the world. It was on a late Saturday afternoon, nearly a week after the meeting, when Ryan found himself walking through the park near their house. He didn't have any particular reason for going out, just a restless need to clear his head. The late autumn chill nipped at his cheeks as he walked along the gravel path, the crunch of leaves beneath his feet a steady rhythm. He hadn't expected to see anyone, but as he rounded a corner, he saw a familiar face sitting alone on a bench. It was Ms. Foster, her back straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking out over the park with a contemplative expression. Ryan stopped in his tracks, not sure if he should approach her or just turn and walk the other way. But before he could make up his mind, she saw him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she stood up slowly, her expression neutral, but softer than he had seen before. "Ryan," she said, her voice tentative, almost unsure. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ryan didn't know what to say at first. The anger from their last interaction still lingered somewhere in the back of his mind, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been. He'd had time to think about everything, to consider her apology and the things his dad had said. "I didn't expect to see you either," Ryan said, his voice steady but guarded. He took a step forward, unsure of how to handle the situation. They were standing in the same space, but it felt like there was an invisible divide between them. The conversation that needed to happen was still so foreign, so raw. Ms. Foster hesitated, then took a slow breath. "I wanted to say, again, how sorry I am for what happened. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm trying to learn from it. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about respect, about families like yours, and I realize now how much I took that for granted, how much I missed." Ryan stood still, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. She wasn't offering an excuse, and that was something. Her apology wasn't like the half-hearted words she'd thrown out before. It felt real now, measured, almost painfully honest. But still, Ryan wasn't sure if he could accept it just yet. "I didn't want to make a big deal out of this," Ryan said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I didn't want it to turn into something bigger than it needed to be. But you made it bigger, and I didn't get to choose that. I didn't want to be some kind of symbol. I just wanted you to stop disrespecting me and my dad." Ms. Foster nodded, a sad understanding in her eyes. "I know, I understand now. I didn't realize how much I had overstepped, and I certainly didn't understand how deeply the things I said could hurt someone. I'm not proud of what I did. It's going to take me time to make this right, starting with listening. And if that means facing what happened, facing the truth of it all, then that's what I need to do." Ryan felt a weight in his chest, like something heavy was being lifted but replaced with something harder, something that felt raw. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," Ryan admitted, "but I don't want to hold on to that anger anymore. I don't think it helps either of us." The air between them felt a little less charged, like the beginning of some kind of truce, an understanding that hadn't been there before. But Ryan still wasn't sure how to process it all. The apology, the changes that were being made, everything was happening so fast, and it felt like he was expected to adjust just as quickly. "I'll keep working at it," Ms. Foster said, her voice quiet but resolute. "And if you ever feel like talking, I'm here. I want to make sure you know that I'm truly committed to making this right, even if it takes time." Ryan nodded, feeling the knot in his stomach loosen. He didn't know if this conversation would fix everything, but it felt like a step in the right direction. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll keep that in mind." They stood there for a moment, neither of them saying anything, but the silence wasn't as uncomfortable as it had been before. It was different. It was just two people who had been through something difficult, something that couldn't be undone with a single conversation, but could at least start to be repaired bit by bit. Ryan turned to leave, but before he could take a step, Ms. Foster spoke again. "Ryan," she said, her voice a little softer, "your dad was right about one thing. We do need to teach respect. It's not just something we give to others. It's something we learn and earn every day." Ryan looked back over his shoulder, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. Then, without saying anything more, he walked away. The park was quieter now, the air colder, but he felt something inside him shift. Maybe things were starting to make sense. Maybe, just maybe, the hardest lessons were the ones you had to learn yourself. The days after the conversation with Ms. Foster felt like a turning point for Ryan, but there was still a gnawing sense of uncertainty in the back of his mind. The weight of what had happened wasn't something that could be erased overnight. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about what came next, about how the town would continue to move forward and how people would treat each other from here on out. Ryan's mornings were no longer filled with the familiar dread of facing the stares or the whispers. In fact, the atmosphere at school seemed to have shifted. There was a quiet understanding in the halls. The kids, while still curious and hesitant, had begun to respect the boundaries that had been set. The teachers, those who had once seen him only as just another kid, were beginning to look at him differently. He could feel it in the way they spoke to him, in the way they listened. And for the first time, Ryan could sense that the respect wasn't just for his father anymore. It was for him too. But the true test of everything came on the next Veterans Day ceremony. The school had planned a special event to honor local veterans, and this year it was more personal than ever. Ryan knew that this was more than just a chance for the community to pay tribute to the sacrifices of those who had served. It was an opportunity for the town to show the world how they had learned from their mistakes, how they had been forced to confront their assumptions about respect, about service, and about the importance of family. And it was an opportunity for Ryan to take his place in that narrative, to be more than just the veteran's son. He had a voice now, and he was determined to use it. The ceremony was held in the school gym, a modest but heartfelt space, filled with flags, banners, and the faces of those who had served. Ryan stood with his classmates, his hand over his heart, listening as the national anthem played. His father, standing at the back of the gym with the other veterans, looked proud as always, but there was something different about the way he held himself today. It wasn't just the pride of being recognized, it was something deeper, something that came from knowing that they had made it through a hard fight, and now they were standing stronger for it. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as the principal, Mr. Carter, took the stage to begin the ceremony. The usual speeches followed, the same ones about honor, sacrifice, and pride, but this time, Ryan couldn't help but think of how different the tone had been since the meeting. The words now carried a weight they hadn't before. The town wasn't just reciting familiar lines, they were living them, they were owning them. And as the principal spoke, Ryan could hear the sincerity in his voice, the real commitment to change. Then, to Ryan's surprise, Mr. Carter turned to him. "Today," the principal said, his voice echoing in the gym, "we have the privilege of hearing from one of our own. Ryan Harlow, son of Tom Harlow, a true hero, has agreed to share a few words with us. Ryan?" The room fell silent, and Ryan felt the eyes of the entire school on him. His heart skipped a beat, but this time, he didn't feel that old, familiar terror. It was different. It wasn't about being judged. It wasn't about being mocked. It was about standing up and being counted, about telling his story, about owning his truth. He stepped forward, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. The crowd waited, every eye on him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of their attention. But he didn't back down. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You've got more strength than you realize." And with that, he started to speak. "I know a lot of you know my dad," Ryan began, his voice steady but filled with the emotion he had been carrying for so long. "He's a veteran. He's been through a lot, seen things that none of us could ever imagine. But what you don't always see is how much a veteran's family has to go through too. We don't wear medals, we don't get recognized for our sacrifices, but we give everything, just like they do. And sometimes, we don't get the respect we deserve." Ryan paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. The room was silent, hanging on his every word. "Last week, some of you heard about what happened with Ms. Foster," he continued. "She made fun of me in class, and she made fun of my dad. She didn't think about how that would feel, how it would hurt. And it wasn't just about me. It was about the kind of respect that people like my dad, people who serve this country, deserve. They don't deserve to be laughed at or mocked. They deserve to be honored." His voice shook slightly, but it wasn't with fear. It was with the fire of everything he had been holding inside, everything he had been carrying for weeks. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small. "I'm here today," he said, his eyes meeting his father's, "because I want you all to know that we can do better. We can be better. We can show respect to everyone, not just the ones who look like us or think like us, but to the ones who've fought, the ones who've sacrificed. I'm proud of my dad. I'm proud of what he did, and I'm proud to be his son. But I'm also proud of every man and woman who has served. They deserve to be treated with dignity, and that's something we can all work toward." The room was still, as if everyone was holding their breath. Ryan's heart raced, but there was a calm in his chest now. He had said it. He had spoken his truth, and it felt like something had shifted, not just in the room, but inside him. When he finished, the gym was quiet for a moment. Then, as if on cue, the applause started. It began slowly, uncertain at first, but then it grew louder, spreading like a wave through the crowd. Ryan didn't know if they were applauding his words or if they were applauding the change that was happening in their town. But in that moment, it didn't matter. His father stood at the back of the gym, his face proud, his posture straight as always. But there was something softer in his expression. Ryan caught his eye, and his father gave him a small, approving nod. That was all Ryan needed. He had done what he came here to do. He had spoken for the people who couldn't, for the ones who had been silenced, for the ones who had fought and been forgotten. And in that moment, he knew that this wasn't just about a teacher's mistake anymore. It was about a community coming together to do better, to be better. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like he had made a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of everyone who had ever been overlooked, who had ever felt invisible. The applause continued, but all Ryan could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and sure. He had found his voice, and nothing, no one, would ever take that away. The days that followed the ceremony were nothing like what Ryan had expected. He had spoken his truth in front of the whole school, and he had felt a weight lift off his shoulders in the process. But the aftermath wasn't a return to normalcy. It was something entirely different. He felt the ripples of his words spreading throughout the town, affecting people in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about what had happened with Miss Foster anymore. It was about something bigger. The community, in its own quiet way, was changing. At school, the whispers had mostly quieted. Ryan still felt the weight of the eyes on him every now and then, but it wasn't judgment he saw anymore. It was recognition. People were looking at him differently now, not with pity, not with the awkwardness of a misunderstood incident, but with respect. Even those who hadn't known what to think before were nodding, acknowledging his strength in ways they hadn't before. And for the first time, Ryan realized that the shift wasn't just in the way they saw him, it was in how they saw themselves. It wasn't easy, though. There were still moments that caught him off guard, moments when his past self would have shrunk away, the vulnerability of being the veteran's son weighing too heavily on him. In the lunchroom one afternoon, a kid from his history class, someone who had never really paid him much attention before, sat down next to him. "Hey Ryan," the kid said, almost cautiously, like he wasn't sure if this was an awkward conversation waiting to happen. Ryan glanced over, unsure of what this was about. "Hey," Ryan said, keeping his tone neutral. He wasn't sure what this kid's angle was, but he didn't want to be rude either. "I wanted to, say thanks," the kid continued. "I heard your speech, and I get it now. You know, about the whole, respect thing. I didn't really think about it before, but I guess it's more than just a joke. What your dad went through, what you went through, it's real, and I didn't get that until you said it." Ryan blinked, surprised by the genuine tone in the kid's voice. This wasn't what he had expected at all. "Yeah, it's real, and it matters." The kid nodded, then stood up. "I'm sorry for what happened, and I'm gonna try to be better. I just wanted to say that." Ryan was left staring at the kid's retreating figure, a faint sense of pride creeping up on him. It wasn't that this one interaction changed everything, but it was a start. Ryan had made a dent in the armor of complacency, and it was having a ripple effect. But not everything was as simple as a few words of acknowledgement. The town, for all its progress, still had work to do. And there were some moments where Ryan had to face the truth about how deep the divide went. The following weekend, Ryan and his dad attended a small town gathering at the local Veterans Hall. It was a regular thing, just a chance for people to get together, share stories, and remember the past. But this time, something felt different. As they walked in, there was an energy in the air that Ryan couldn't ignore. People had started to take notice, not just of his dad, but of the larger issue at hand. His father had always been a quiet figure in the town, respected but distant, the type to keep to himself and not stir the pot. But Ryan could feel the undercurrent of conversation that was building. He and Tom made their way to the back of the room, where the veterans usually gathered. Some of them looked up as they entered, their faces lit up with recognition, and, in some cases, gratitude. It wasn't just because of Tom's military service. It was because of the way his son had stood up for them. Ryan hadn't fully understood it until that moment. The quiet, powerful support that flowed from the men and women who had fought in wars, not just for their country, but for each other. His father was a part of something bigger than just his own experiences. He was part of a brotherhood, a family that stretched across generations, one that didn't let each other go. "Good to see you, son," a gruff voice called from across the room. Ryan turned to see Dave, a retired sergeant who had served alongside his father years ago. Dave was one of the few people in town who knew the depth of what Tom had gone through, and he wasn't afraid to share it. Ryan smiled as he walked over to the table where Dave was sitting. "Hey Dave, how's it going?" "Better now that you're here," Dave said, his smile wide and genuine. "You did good, kid. Your speech, that was something else." Made a lot of us proud. Ryan nodded, feeling his chest tighten. I just said what needed to be said. Doesn't matter if you said it or not. You had the guts to speak up when most folks wouldn't have, Dave said, his voice low, but his eyes full of respect. Your dad's been a solid man, always. But it's good to see you carrying that weight now. Ryan looked over at his father, who was talking to a group of veterans near the bar. Tom caught his eye, offering a subtle nod of acknowledgement. It was the kind of acknowledgement Ryan had been waiting for, one that didn't need words to validate it, one that told him he was finally part of something too. As the evening went on, the atmosphere shifted. People gathered around Ryan and Tom, some asking about the speech, others sharing their own stories of struggle and pride. The conversation turned toward the community's response to the events with Ms. Foster, and it was clear that this wasn't just an issue about one teacher anymore. It was about how the town viewed its veterans, its military families, and its role in acknowledging the struggles of those who served. Ryan found himself listening to older veterans talk about their own battles, physical and emotional, about how their service had shaped them and their families. Some had been through wars that Ryan could never truly understand, but what he did understand was the unspoken bond that connected them all. The evening wound down, and the veterans slowly began to trickle out. Ryan and Tom stayed a little longer, lingering in the corner, just talking. I didn't expect all this, Dad, Ryan said, glancing around at the men and women who had gathered in the hall. I didn't expect the town to, well, get it. Tom chuckled softly. The thing is, son, you can't force people to see what's important. They have to come to it on their own. But the truth always comes out, whether people like it or not. It's just a matter of standing firm when the time comes. Ryan looked at his father, feeling that quiet, unspoken understanding between them. The respect, the pride, the dignity. It wasn't just about the medals or the uniforms. It was about standing up for what was right. And in a way, he had done that. They had done that together. As they left the Veterans Hall, the crisp night air greeted them. Ryan could feel the tension that had been weighing on him for so long slowly easing away. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he had fought for his family, for the respect they deserved, and for the future that was just beginning to take shape. And as he walked beside his father, his chest swelling with pride, Ryan knew that this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about changing the way people saw the world. It was about the quiet victories that no one else saw, but that meant everything, and he was ready for whatever came next. The following weeks passed with a strange, quiet sense of change that Ryan couldn't quite shake. His days at school became a bit easier to navigate, though the shadows of the past lingered in subtle ways. People were different now. They were more cautious with their words, more deliberate in their interactions, and somehow, there was this unspoken acknowledgement between him and the town that what had happened was more than just a single incident. It was a reckoning. Ryan tried to focus on getting back to his routine. His grades improved, and the social circles he once felt so disconnected from began to open up in small, unexpected ways. Eli, his best friend, had stuck by him through all of it, but now there was something new in their friendship, something unspoken that neither of them acknowledged directly, but both felt. They didn't have to explain it. Ryan had done something important, something that had forced people to see beyond the surface. They didn't need to put words to it. They both just understood. But there was still one lingering question on Ryan's mind. His father had always been a rock for him, a quiet force of strength, a man who had seen and done things Ryan could never fully comprehend. And yet, despite everything that had happened, despite the way the town had rallied behind them, there was still something that didn't feel completely settled. Ryan noticed it in the way his father moved through the world, always steady, always calm, but there were times when Tom seemed distracted, withdrawn, like the weight of something old and unspoken was still pressing down on him. It wasn't that he wasn't proud of Ryan, it was just that Tom's pride was always so quietly reserved, so internal. Ryan had never really asked about his father's past before, the things Tom had seen during his time in service, the sacrifices he had made. But now, Ryan found himself wondering if there was something he needed to understand. One evening after dinner, Ryan found himself sitting next to Tom on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The world was quiet, the air cooling as night settled in. Ryan had noticed the tiredness in his dad's eyes recently, the kind that wasn't about work or the usual stresses of life, It was the kind of tiredness that seemed to come from deeper places, from places that had yet to be shared. "Dad?" Ryan asked, his voice almost hesitant. He hadn't planned on saying anything, but the words seemed to come out before he could stop them. "Is everything okay? I mean, you've been kinda distant lately. I don't know, like more than usual." Tom's head turned slowly toward him, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Ryan watched as his father took a deep breath, his eyes looking past Ryan into the horizon, as if searching for something that wasn't there. It wasn't that Tom didn't trust him. It was more like there were pieces of himself that he had never fully revealed to anyone, not even to his own son. "I've been carrying things with me for a long time, Ryan," Tom said, his voice low and gravelly, as if the words took effort to pull out. "Things that go deeper than what people know, things that don't always fade just because time passes. You can't just forget what you've been through. It stays with you." Ryan's chest tightened. He had always known his father was tough, resilient beyond measure, but hearing him say it aloud was different. It wasn't like Tom to admit vulnerability. And as much as Ryan had always admired his father's strength, he realized for the first time that there was so much more beneath the surface that he hadn't understood. "What do you mean?" Ryan asked quietly, trying not to push, but feeling the pull to understand. Tom exhaled, rubbing his hand over his face. "You were so young when I came back, son. You don't remember the person I was before I left, before everything changed. The man I came back as, it wasn't the same. I don't talk about it much because it's hard. But it's always been there. The things I've seen, the things I've had to do, the people I've lost." He trailed off, his eyes distant. "You try to bury it. You try to move on. But sometimes it catches up with you." Ryan felt a surge of empathy and a deep ache in his chest. His dad had always been a hero to him, someone untouchable, someone who had the answers. But now, hearing him speak this way, Ryan realized how much he had never really understood. Tom had carried his burdens alone for so long, never asking for help, never showing weakness. But Ryan knew now that strength didn't come from hiding your pain, it came from acknowledging it and finding ways to heal. "I didn't want to show you any of that, Ryan," Tom continued, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of his words was wearing on him. "I didn't want you to carry what I've carried. You deserve to live your life without that kind of burden. That's why I keep it inside." Ryan shook his head, his throat tight with emotion. "But you don't have to carry it alone, Dad. I'm here. I don't want you to keep it all locked up. I don't care about the past. I care about you." Tom's eyes softened, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his face. He placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder, squeezing it gently, a silent acknowledgement of the love and understanding passing between them. "I know, son, I know." For a long while, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind and the distant hum of life continuing in the town. But, in that quiet moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't a resolution, and it wasn't some grand emotional breakthrough, but it was something more real than anything Ryan had experienced before. His father wasn't some distant, invincible figure. He was a man who had lived through things Ryan couldn't fully understand, but who had kept going anyway. And now, Ryan was beginning to understand the depths of his father's strength, and the importance of being there for him, just as he had always been there for him. "You're right," Tom said finally, his voice steady once more. "I've kept too much inside, but I'm getting better at sharing it. It's not about forgetting the past, but finding a way to carry it without letting it weigh you down. And you, Ryan, you've shown me that. Your strength, your ability to speak up. Hell, that's the kind of courage I wish I'd had when I was your age." Ryan didn't know what to say. He felt the deep truth in his father's words, but there was something else too. A quiet pride that wasn't about the medals, the ceremonies, or the speeches. It was about something deeper. It was about family, about supporting each other through the darkest parts, about never letting go of the love that connected them, even when life felt like it was pushing them apart. "I'm proud of you, son," Tom added, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected you to carry that weight, but you did, and you did it with more courage than I could ever have asked for." Ryan looked up at his father, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about understanding what it meant to carry your history with you and make it your own, And in that moment, Ryan knew that no matter where life took him, he would always have his father's strength and his love to guide him. They sat there in silence, watching the last slivers of daylight fade into the night. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt that everything was going to be okay. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but it no longer felt like something that had to define them. It was just a part of who they were, a part of what had brought them here, and that was enough. The days that followed the quiet conversation on the porch felt like the final chapters of a story Ryan had never expected to be part of. The town, his family, and even he himself had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. What had started as an incident at school, a small confrontation with a teacher, had spiraled into something far larger than he could have predicted. It was more than just a fight for respect. It had become a movement, a moment in the town's history that would be remembered for years to come. As the fall began to settle into winter, the air became crisp and the holidays drew near. People seemed to be in a better mood around town. There was a renewed sense of community, of people coming together in ways that hadn't been seen in a long time. It was as if Ryan's speech had cracked open something buried deep within the town, an unspoken need for connection, for understanding, for healing. The workshops on respecting veterans and their families were packed. People weren't just showing up out of obligation anymore. They were genuinely interested in listening, in learning. The veterans in town began to gather more often, not just for ceremonies or meetings, but for casual gatherings, dinners, and barbecues, reconnecting with each other and with their families in ways they hadn't in years. It wasn't about sharing war stories or the weight of the past. It was about simply being together, about offering a space where they could be seen, heard, and understood. Ryan and his father attended more than one of those gatherings, and each time, Ryan saw something new in the men and women who had served. They were all, in their own way, broken. Scarred by things that couldn't be fixed, things that couldn't be undone. But together, they were stronger. Together, they were a force that carried each other's burdens without even thinking about it. That was what Ryan had learned. Strength wasn't just about standing alone and enduring. It was about standing together, no matter how hard it got, no matter what came next. One evening, as Ryan and Tom sat on the porch after dinner, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the trees, they heard the faint sound of a car approaching. It wasn't unusual. People in the neighborhood often stopped by to chat, but this time, the car was different. It was a sleek black sedan, something that didn't quite fit the small-town vibe. The car pulled up slowly, the engine purring quietly as it came to a stop in front of their house. Ryan glanced over at his father, who was already standing up, his expression unreadable. Tom had a way of carrying himself that made people take notice, even without saying a word, and the tension that ran between father and son was palpable. The car door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a sharp suit. His hair was dark, combed neatly to the side, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses even though the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. He looked out of place here, a stranger in this quiet town. But when he turned to face them, Ryan saw something that made his stomach twist. The man's eyes were familiar. It was the lawyer from the school district, the one who had been brought in to handle the situation with Miss Foster, the one who had been so careful with his words, so guarded. Ryan hadn't expected to see him here, especially not now, not after everything had calmed down. Tom's jaw tightened as the man approached the porch, his footsteps steady, but Ryan could sense the unspoken question in the air. Why was he here? What did this mean? Mr. Harlow, the lawyer said as he reached the steps, removing his sunglasses with a smooth motion. His voice was cold, calculated, but there was something else behind it, something Ryan couldn't quite place. I hope I'm not interrupting. Tom didn't immediately respond. His gaze didn't waver from the lawyer's, and there was a long, heavy silence between them. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice low but firm. What do you want? The lawyer hesitated, clearly aware of the weight of the situation. Ryan stood behind his father, his chest tight with curiosity and growing anxiety. The tension between them seemed to hum in the air. I've been asked to bring you an offer, the lawyer began, looking from Tom to Ryan. The school board has reviewed the events surrounding the incident with Ms. Foster, and they've decided to take a more proactive approach in dealing with situations like this in the future. We're aware of the changes in your family's reputation around town and the efforts you've made to advocate for veterans and their families. The board wants to resolve this matter in a way that benefits both sides. Tom's expression hardened, his posture tense. "And what does that mean exactly?" The lawyer's eyes flickered briefly, but his composure never faltered. "The school is offering a public apology to you and your son. They're also willing to offer a donation to a veterans charity of your choice as a sign of goodwill and to reinforce their commitment to supporting the military community." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. This sounded too good to be true, and he wasn't sure if he trusted it. His father's silence only made the situation more intense, and Ryan could feel his father's cautious scrutiny weighing on the lawyer. "What's the catch?" Tom's voice was low, almost menacing in its calm. The lawyer's lips pressed into a thin line. "There are no catches, Mr. Harlow. The school is willing to make amends, but in exchange, they ask that you agree to publicly accept the apology and let the matter rest. No further actions, no further involvement with the media." Tom looked at Ryan for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Ryan could tell his father was weighing the decision carefully. They had already made their stand, hadn't they? They'd done what they set out to do, and now the town had shifted. The community was listening. The idea of letting it go, of accepting the apology and moving on, seemed almost anticlimactic, but Ryan could sense that his father was seeing something deeper in all of this. "I don't need their apology," Tom said finally, his voice unwavering. "But if this means the school will start doing right by kids like Ryan, then maybe it's worth something. I won't let this go, but I'll accept the gesture." Ryan felt a pang of surprise. It wasn't that he didn't understand his father's decision. It was just that, in the end, it wasn't about what he could extract from the situation. It was about what the town needed to see, what they all needed to learn. And sometimes, that meant letting go of the fight, even when it wasn't over. The lawyer nodded, as if he had anticipated the answer. "I'll make arrangements then, Mr. Harlow. Thank you for your time." As the lawyer turned and walked back to his car, Ryan and Tom remained standing on the porch, watching him go. The air was still heavy with unspoken words, but there was a sense of finality now, a sense that this chapter was closing, but the story wasn't over. Ryan knew that the lessons learned, the battles fought, and the changes made would ripple through this town for years to come. They had done more than just stand up for what was right. They had changed the conversation. And as Ryan stood beside his father, he finally understood what it meant to carry that weight with pride. They had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or silenced. The door was closing on this chapter, but Ryan knew another one was already beginning, and he was ready to face it. The final days of the semester passed quietly, with a sense of closure settling over the town. Ryan had expected some form of finality after the town meeting, after the apology and the acknowledgement that had followed. But life didn't wrap up neatly like that. The lessons didn't stop just because the drama had subsided. The people who had been part of it, the students, the teachers, the veterans, the families, had all shifted in subtle ways. Ryan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But in a way that was okay. It was change, and change was hard but necessary. The apology had come, just as the lawyer had promised. A formal statement, read aloud at the next town meeting, followed by the promised donation to the veterans charity of their choosing. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but Ryan felt the weight of it. It wasn't just about the money or the formality, it was about the recognition. The acknowledgement that what had happened hadn't been right, that the community had learned something in the process. Tom didn't speak much about the events of that week. He never was one for fanfare or for taking too much credit for anything. He had always done his duty, silently, without expectation. But Ryan saw the way he stood a little taller, the way the town looked at him differently now. People respected him even more. They respected Ryan too. As winter melted into spring, things slowly began to return to a new normal. Ryan found himself getting back to his routine, his life slowly easing into the rhythm of things. He hung out with Eli more, spent time with his dad fixing up the house, and finally began to feel like the weight of everything that had happened was no longer hanging over him. But there was still one thing left undone. A month after the town meeting, Ryan was walking home from school when he saw Ms. Foster standing on the front steps of the school. Her figure was smaller than he remembered, her stance less confident, almost hesitant. She didn't see him at first, but Ryan couldn't help but feel drawn to her. There was a momentary flash of anger, the memory of her mocking him and his father, but it wasn't as sharp as before. It didn't hold the same power over him. Instead, it was just there, a thing that had happened. He stopped a few feet from her, not sure if he should say anything, if he should acknowledge her at all, but then she turned and their eyes met. She froze for a second, as if unsure of what to do, but then she offered a small, almost tentative smile. "Ryan," she said quietly, almost like she wasn't sure if she had the right to speak to him, "I didn't expect to see you today." Ryan studied her for a moment, his gaze softening as he considered her. It was clear that the apology wasn't just a formality for her. It had come with real weight. He saw the regret in her eyes, the understanding that she had done something wrong, something that couldn't be taken back. He didn't feel anger anymore, just an understanding. "I didn't expect to see you either," Ryan said, his voice steady but not cold. "But it's been a while." She nodded, her hands nervously fiddling with the straps of her bag. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what I said. I didn't realize, at the time, just how much it would affect you. I'm sorry, really. And I don't just mean for the joke I made. I mean for how I treated you, how I disrespected your family. You didn't deserve that." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He could see she was truly remorseful, but he wasn't sure if forgiveness was something that could happen instantly. He didn't want to say something just to make her feel better. Instead, he took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "You were wrong, Ms. Foster," he said, "and it hurt. But I get it now too. You learned, and that's more than most people ever do. So, I'm not going to hold it against you forever. But it took a lot for me to get to that place." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of hope, some sign that the bridge could be rebuilt. Ryan didn't have the perfect words to offer her, but he knew this. It wasn't about forgiveness, and it wasn't about forgetting. It was about understanding that people could change, even if it took a long time. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for giving me that chance." Ryan gave her a small nod, then turned to leave. As he walked down the path, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Things were different now. The story wasn't over, not really. But it was the kind of change that didn't need to be dramatic. It didn't need to be loud. It was in the small moments, the understanding, the compassion, the lessons learned, that made everything feel just a little bit more right. When he got home that evening, Tom was in the garage working on a project as usual. Ryan stood in the doorway, watching his father for a moment, taking in the familiar sight of the man who had been his rock through everything. "Hey, Dad," Ryan said, his voice quiet but full of something he couldn't quite put into words. Tom looked up, his eyes meeting Ryan's. There was a long pause, but Ryan didn't need to say much. Tom stood, wiping his hands on his work shirt, and walked over to him. For a moment, father and son stood together in silence, just looking at each other. "I'm proud of you, son," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did what I could never have done at your age, and you did it for the right reasons." Ryan looked at his dad, the words settling deep in his heart. He had always been proud of his father, of everything he had done, of everything he had been. But today, in this moment, Ryan realized that his father wasn't just proud of him because of the things he had done. He was proud because Ryan had become someone who understood the weight of respect, of standing up for what was right. And Ryan was proud of himself too. Because in the end, this story wasn't just about standing up for his family, it was about standing up for a community, for a whole town that had learned the hard way. It was about changing the conversation, about making sure that the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles. So as the sun set behind the trees and the cool evening breeze swept through the yard, Ryan knew that this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of something else, something real, something that would last.